Today is the last sermon in this series about the resolutions that disciples make as we try to follow Jesus Christ. What I want to talk about with you today is the fact that as disciples of Christ, all of us will face failure. All of us, in one way or another, will at some point fail to live up to our calling as disciples of Christ. So failure is not so much a resolution that we make as it is a reality that all of us face. The good news is that it is through our failures that we gain a much better understanding of the depth of God's love and of His grace. So let us pray. Holy God, we come before you this morning as people who have failed, and as people who will fail again. So we need your word of grace to us this morning. To lift us up, to encourage us, and to transform us. We ask that you would do this by your Holy Spirit. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. I'm reading today from near the end of Matthew's Gospel. It's in chapter 26, verses 69 to 75. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. And a servant girl came up to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you mean." And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." And then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. Again, this is the word of the Lord. So Jesus, at this point, has finished his Last Supper with the disciples. He has prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's been betrayed by Judas and handed over to the religious authorities to go to trial. And that's where he is when Peter is also out in the courtyard. Jesus is inside on trial for his faith. He's being charged by the high priest with blasphemy for saying that he is the Christ, the Son of God. You know how the story goes from there. He's convicted also by the Romans, and then he's executed on the cross. Jesus is on trial in the courtroom of the high priest, and at some point or another, all of us face the same thing. At some point, every one of us finds ourselves in a courtroom that puts our faith on trial. That courtroom might be a tragic event that happens in your life, and it turns your world upside down and leaves you doubting the goodness of God or even the existence of God. The courtroom could be a bad experience that you've had with the church, with other Christians, when you were hurt or disappointed by someone. Your courtroom could be a long journey through grief or depression or unemployment. And it makes it harder for you to continue trusting in the faithfulness of God. The courtroom looks a little different for each one of us, but it's a place that at some point we are all familiar with. But the real test for a disciple is not just the courtroom, but the courtyard. That's where Peter is in our text. At the same time Jesus is being questioned by the high priest, Peter is outside in the courtyard on trial himself, although he doesn't know that he's on trial. He was the only one of the disciples that was brave enough to follow Jesus all the way into the courtyard. All the others left when Judas betrayed Jesus. They ran away from the guards and from the mob that Philip is arresting Jesus. But Peter, probably disguising himself a little bit, followed at a distance all the way into the courtyard of the high priest, because he wanted to see what was going on. So he's sitting with these guards and a group of bystanders to find out what's going to happen to Jesus. Now, Peter was prepared for the courtroom where Jesus was. Just a few verses earlier in the same chapter, Peter said, Jesus, I'm willing to go all the way to the cross with you. I'm willing to die with you. And that's when Jesus said, no, you're going to deny me 3 times. So Peter is actually very brave. Sometimes we read this story and we think, well, Peter was just afraid out in the courtyard. He was a coward. And so he denied Jesus because he was afraid of what would happen. But I'm not so sure. Peter was the only one who followed Jesus that far. He said he was ready to die. He was the only disciple that walked on water. There are so many stories of Peter being actually very brave and very willing to risk his neck for Jesus. So I think Peter was prepared for the courtroom. He was prepared to be on trial himself, if necessary. But he was not prepared for the courtyard. Because out in the courtyard, it was just ordinary people. There was nothing important happening in the courtyard. The real drama was going on inside. When Jesus was on trial, the courtyard was just a group of people that didn't matter. They weren't important to the story. It was just a place on the sidelines where Peter was waiting for something to happen. And yet that is exactly where Peter's trial took place. The theologian Dale Bruner, in his commentary on this text, said that disciples will also be tried in courtrooms, but most of their trials and tests, like Peter's, will take place in the more everyday life of courtyards. The courtyard is any place where you think your faith doesn't matter that much. It also happens to be the place where we spend most of our time. Most of your life will not be in these dramatic situations where your faith is really being tested. Sometimes we go through that, but most of your life is just going to be ordinary. Going to work, coming home, raising a family, buying groceries, going to school. The ordinary things that you do every day, that's most of your life. And that is why it's also the easiest place to think that your faith doesn't matter. For you, the courtyard could be the workplace. It could be a school board meeting, a conversation that you have with some friends over coffee, a comment that you leave on Facebook. It could even be church. Some of us spend a lot of time around church. That becomes very familiar. I'm a pastor. Trust me, I know. And it can be easy to think, well, our faith doesn't really matter there. I mean, after all, we're in church. We must be faithful. That's not always a safe assumption. Our faith in Jesus Christ matters just as much in the courtyard as it does in the courtroom. And when we think it doesn't, that's when we start to deny Jesus. Peter denied Jesus 3 times in a row. Each time more intense, swearing an oath, just making it worse each time. The first 2 times that he denies Jesus were because a servant girl, a couple of servant girls that were out in the courtyard, probably the most insignificant people in that whole society, came up to him and said, hey, I think you were one of those disciples with Jesus, weren't you? And he says, no, I don't know what you're talking about. First time he tries to pretend he doesn't even know what's going on. Second time he swears and says, I swear by God that I don't know the man. And then the third time, it is the bystanders, the group of people who are now paying attention. They're listening in, so it's getting worse for Peter. And they challenge him, and he denies it to the bystanders. Peter could not have done any worse for himself. His denials were emphatic. I do not know this man. But Peter was not just denying Jesus in front of these people. Peter was denying Jesus to these people. He was denying them the opportunity to know more about Jesus. We also deny Jesus to people when we do what Peter did and we treat them like bystanders. Like people who are unimportant to the story. Like people who don't matter. Peter was focused on what was going on in the courtroom. He didn't care about the people in the courtyard. They were just getting in the way. They were becoming a nuisance. And so he tried to just shut them up and get rid of them. I don't know what you're talking about. Let me focus on what's important. Sometimes we are like Peter. We become preoccupied with what's going on inside of our own lives or inside of our own church. And we ignore the people that walk down the street or go to the park on a Sunday afternoon. We ignore the bystanders, our neighbors. Or sometimes we're so busy focused on our own spirituality, our own relationship with God. We're looking for our next great experience with Jesus, that we forget to look for God in the everyday stuff, like coming to church, and going to the store, and going to work, and going to school. And when we do that, when we ignore our neighbors and overlook all the ordinary stuff of life, and overlook God in those places, we are essentially denying everything that Jesus taught. We also deny Jesus to people when we isolate ourselves from other Christians, when we cut ourselves off from the church. That's what Peter's third denial, I think, is all about. The first two, again, were the servant girls, and Peter denied it to them. But the third one was the group of bystanders, and they didn't just say, hey, you were with Jesus. They said, hey, you were one of them. You were part of the group that followed Jesus, weren't you? Peter says, no, I wasn't. So he doesn't just deny Christ, he denies the church. He denies being part of the Christian community, which in the story is the same thing as denying Christ. After all, the church is the body of Christ. When we deny that, we are also denying Jesus. Sometimes we are embarrassed to be associated with other Christians, aren't we? Or what the church is doing throughout the world. Sometimes Christians have done incredibly hurtful things, embarrassing things, and we want to distance ourselves and say, I have a relationship with Jesus, but I don't need religion. I don't need the church. Think about what you see happening in the world right now. The last few days, I keep hearing on the radio about the Central African Republic. Some of you have heard about this. Where Christians have undertaken a campaign of violence and eradication against the Muslim population. They are murdering people in the name of Christ. We don't want to be associated with that, do we? Of course not. That's not Christian, so you can see how people would want to pull away and say, I'm not part of the Christian church because of the embarrassing things that they've done. And certainly there are embarrassing things that the church has done. Certainly we need healing as much as anybody else. But denying the church, disassociating from the body of Christ, is the same as denying Christ himself. And then finally, we also deny Jesus to people when our lives don't look any different as a result of following him. This is one of my favorite parts of the story. The bystanders are listening to Peter as he's saying, I don't know this guy, I don't know this guy. And they say, listen to your accent. You're obviously from Galilee, that's where Jesus was from. Your accent gives you away. Clearly, you were a follower of Jesus. Peter couldn't help but sound like someone who belonged with Jesus. And the sad reality is that for many Christians today, there is nothing about their lives that gives them away as Christians. Nothing that makes them stand out as obviously a follower of Jesus Christ. In his book, In his book, The Ragamuffin Gospel, Brennan Manning said this. He said, "The single greatest cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and then walk out the door and deny him by their lifestyle." That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. Gandhi once said something similar. He said, "I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. They are so unlike your Christ." Can other people tell that we have been with Jesus? Is it obvious by the way that we live, by the way that we speak and work and play? Our lives will either confirm our faith in Jesus Christ or they will deny Christ. It is one or the other. There is no in between. Can people tell that we have been with Jesus? Well, after his third denial, the rooster crowed and Peter knew that his failure as a disciple was complete. So he went out and wept bitterly. You know what that feels like. You know what it feels like to fail so badly, to regret what you've done or haven't done in the past, to the point that there's nothing you can do. All that you know how to do is break down and weep. Seems like that's all that you can do. But there is one other option that you have in those moments. There's one other thing that you can choose to do, and that is to remember the word of Jesus. Matthew says that when the rooster crowed, Peter remembered the word of Jesus when Jesus said, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." Jesus predicted that Peter would fail. And at first, that seems like bad news. That sounds like condemnation from Jesus. It's like salt in the wound. Great, not only did I fail Jesus, but Jesus knew that I would fail. He expected me to fail. Thanks a lot, Jesus. I'm usually pretty good at beating myself up. I don't really need your help. But the word of Jesus, even though it can be brutally honest, is always meant to be a word of grace. And here's how that grace sounds in this story. Yes, Jesus knew that Peter would fail. And Jesus chose Peter anyway. That's the grace. Jesus knew that Peter would fail and he chose him anyway. Jesus' prediction was not meant to condemn Peter, but to save him, so that when Peter failed, he could remember that word and say, Jesus knew, and yet he still chose me. Jesus knew that I would fail as a disciple, as a parent, as a spouse, as a child, as an employee, as a boss. Jesus knew that I would fail, and yet he chose me anyway. I can only imagine the ways in which you have failed Jesus. I know the ways I have failed him, and that's plenty to know. But even before your life began, Jesus knew that you would fail. Jesus predicted that you would fail, and he chose you anyway. He said, "Come and follow me. I want you to be my disciple." Jesus picked you. And he wants to keep using you even after your failure. Your failure is not the end of your discipleship. It was not the end for Peter. Peter went on to still be the rock on which the church is built. He started churches. He preached to the religious and political authorities of his day, and thousands of people came to know Jesus because of him. So even despite his failure, he could still be used as a disciple. There's a story I read recently about a chief financial officer in a large corporation who made a terrible investment decision. He lost his company $10 million. The next day, the CEO calls him into his office, and sits him down, and the CEO says, "Do you know why you're here?" And the CFO says, "Well, yeah, I assume you're here to fire me." And the CEO says, "Fire you? Why would I fire you? I just spent $10 million educating you." Yes, he failed. There's life after failure. You can grow from failure. You can still be used after failure. And so your failures are not the last word on your life. Jesus is the only one who ever gets the last word on your life. And it's always a word of grace. It's always a word that says, "I love you," and nothing can ever separate you from that love. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.